I stood in the dimly lit room, the weight of her stare pinning me down. Mary's eyes were red, her breath uneven, and her voice cracked as she whispered, "You've been sleeping with my mother." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I explain something so twisted? And then, before I could even try, her mother walked in. She didn't look panicked or ashamed. She looked calm. And when she spoke, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Your anger doesn't move me," she said, her voice steady. Mary froze, her face draining of color. How it all began. When I met Mary, she seemed like a dream. She was beautiful, charming, and had a spark that drew me in. When she agreed to be mine, I thought I had won the jackpot. But as we got closer, I realized there was a tension in her family, an undercurrent of secrets no one spoke about. Her mother was striking in her own way, confident, sharp, and radiating a kind of authority that made everyone respect her. She had been widowed years ago but remarried a man who seemed to always avoid eye contact with Mary. I noticed the looks her mother gave me early on, the way her voice softened when she addressed me. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. But one evening, when I had come to visit Mary, and she wasn't home yet, everything changed. Mary's mother had invited me to wait inside. We were alone, the room quiet except for the faint sound of rain outside. She offered me wine, and before I knew it, one thing led to another. She seemed to know all my weak spots and I couldn't resist her shenanigans. Before I knew what was happening, I was in bed with her. I told myself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But it did. Mary's mother and I fell into a pattern of secret meetings, stolen moments, and whispered lies. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. And yet, something about Mary's behavior made me uneasy. She was affectionate, but there was a guardedness to her, a wall I couldn't breach. Then there were the arguments she had with her stepfather. They were subtle at first, tense conversations I couldn't fully hear when I visited. But over time, they became explosive. "You don't get to tell me what to do," I heard her scream one day as I approached the compound. Her stepfather stormed past me, his face dark with anger, but he said nothing. When I asked Mary about it later, she shrugged it off. "He's just overbearing," she said, but there was something in her eyes, something that didn't sit right with me. There was a night, not long after Mary and I started planning our engagement, when I saw something I couldn't explain. I had arrived at her family compound late in the evening, unannounced. The house was quiet, the moonlight casting eerie shadows over the yard. I knocked on the door, but no one answered, so I let myself in. I heard muffled voices coming from one of the rooms, Mary's voice, followed by a man's voice. My heart skipped a beat. Was she with someone else? The door to the room was slightly ajar, and as I moved closer, I saw the man. My stomach twisted with jealousy and confusion. But then, I saw his face. It was her stepfather. They were standing close, too close for comfort. Mary looked upset, her arms crossed defensively. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but her tone was sharp, and his was low, almost pleading. I pushed the door open, and they both jumped back, startled. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice laced with suspicion. Mary was quick to recover. "Nothing. My dad was just lecturing me about staying out late. You know how he is." Her stepfather nodded, avoiding my gaze. "Yes, just a fatherly talk." I felt a pang of guilt for doubting her. He was her stepfather, after all. Why would I assume anything else? I apologized and brushed it off. One fateful night, Mary's family had invited me for dinner, a sign that they were ready to formally welcome me into their family. But Mary had left the house unexpectedly, leaving me and her mother alone once again. I should have left. I should have walked away. But instead, I stayed, and I found myself making love with my fiancé's mother. This time, it was so passionate and we didn't hear the door open. By the time we realized Mary was back, it was too late. She stood there, her face a mix of shock and devastation. "You're sleeping with my mother," she said, her voice trembling. Her mother didn't flinch. Instead, she sighed, straightened her wrapper, and said, "Before you judge me, maybe we should talk about you and my husband." I stood there shocked, devastated and confused at the same time. Mary's composure shattered. "What are you talking about? You think I didn't know?" her mother said, her voice cold now. "I've known for months. You and my husband sneaking around, thinking I was blind. I just didn't say anything because I wanted to see how far you would go." Mary turned to me, her face contorted with disbelief. I stood there, my mind racing to make sense of what I was hearing. Mary's mother continued, her words slicing through the room like a blade. "You think you're the only one who can play games? You betrayed me, Mary, with my own husband. So don't act righteous now that you've caught me with yours." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Mary collapsed onto the chair, her hands shaking. There I was, just standing completely frozen. That night was the end of everything. Mary and I called off the engagement, refusing to even look at me as she stormed out of the house. Her relationship with her mother was shattered beyond repair, and her mother's husband left her soon after, unable to face the humiliation. As for me, I became the talk of the town. Whispers followed me everywhere I went, people pointing and shaking their heads. I left there a few months later, unable to bear the weight of my mistakes. Love, lust, betrayal, it all felt like a game we were playing, each of us thinking we could win. But in the end, no one did.